The smell of ozone and recycled air filled the grand auditorium as beings from across the galaxy settled into their seats. Each chair had been specially designed to accommodate different physiologies. Some seats floated in mid-air for the gas-based nebulans, while others were filled with heated sand for the silicon-based rock hearts. The lighting shifted in slow waves between different spectrums to make every species comfortable. Alex Reed pushed through the crowd near the entrance, clutching his datapad and trying not to bump into anyone. A mistake here could cause a diplomatic incident. The tall insect-like mantids clicked their mandibles in what might have been annoyance as he squeezed past. The blue-skinned Aquarians made soft bubbling sounds that could mean anything from hello to a declaration of war. This was only his third time at the Galactic Institute, and Alex still felt like a tourist who had wandered into the wrong building. Everyone else belonged here. They had advanced degrees in xenobiology, centuries of research experience, and grants from their home governments that could buy small moons. Alex was just a junior researcher from Earth, a planet most species had barely heard of until 15 years ago. He found an empty seat in the back row, grateful to be away from the more important attendees. The front rows were filled with living legends. There was Dr. Zenth, whose work on pain tolerance had revolutionized medical treatment for 12 different species. Next to him sat Professor Yila, who had discovered that some species could literally think themselves to death when frightened enough. Her research had prevented 3 separate extinctions. The lights dimmed and Professor Kalath walked onto the stage. She was Altarian, with silver scales that caught the light and 4 eyes that could see into wavelengths humans couldn't even imagine. 2 of her eyes focused on her notes while the other 2 scanned the audience. Alex had read her papers on fear response mechanisms. She was brilliant, methodical, and had never been wrong about anything in her 200-year career. Welcome, colleagues, to our annual symposium on behavioral sciences, Professor Kalath began. Her voice carried perfectly through the auditorium's acoustic systems, automatically translated into hundreds of languages and communication methods. Today we explore one of the most fundamental aspects of sentient life, how different species respond to threat and danger. A holographic display materialized above the stage, showing a 3-dimensional map of known space. Colored dots marked the locations of different species, each one pulsing with a different pattern. Fear response is not merely about survival, the professor continued. It defines how a species interacts with the unknown, how they explore new territories, how they form social bonds, and ultimately, how they develop as a civilization. Alex leaned forward in his seat. This was why he had come here. Earth's scientists were still trying to understand how humans fit into the larger galactic community. Every other species seemed to have some special ability or evolutionary advantage. Humans were just ordinary. The holographic display zoomed in on a cluster of stars near the galactic rim. Consider the Voltan Empire, Professor Kalath said. When threatened, Voltans can shift partially out of phase with normal spacetime. This allows them to avoid physical harm while still maintaining some ability to act in our dimension. This response enabled them to explore dangerous regions of space that would have been fatal to other species. The display shifted to show a different region. The Meridians developed the ability to release complex pheromone clouds when frightened. These chemicals can calm aggressive species, confuse predators, or even serve as a form of chemical communication across vast distances. Their fear response became the foundation of their diplomatic corps. Alex took notes, though he wondered why he bothered. Everything Professor Kalath was saying would be available in the conference database within hours. Still, being here felt important. The subtle details, the way other species reacted to different information, the quiet conversations during breaks, none of that would make it into the official records. The crystalline collective presents perhaps the most elegant solution, the professor said as the display showed a planet covered in what looked like living diamonds. When threatened, their bodies can temporarily shift into a diamond-hard state. They become nearly indestructible while maintaining full sensory awareness. This allowed them to survive in environments that would crush most organic life forms. A soft, chittering sound came from the audience. Alex had learned this was how Altarians laughed. He looked around and saw several beings making similar sounds. of amusement. He wasn't sure what was funny. Professor Kaleth moved to a new section of her presentation. Of course, not all species developed such sophisticated responses. Some remained quite primitive in their threat management systems. The holographic display now showed a small blue-green planet on the outer edge of human space. Alex recognized it immediately. Earth. Humans represent an interesting case study in basic fear response mechanisms, Professor Kaleth continued. When threatened, they experience what they call an adrenaline rush. This causes minor increases in strength and reaction time, but nothing approaching the capabilities we've observed in more advanced species. More chittering sounds filled the auditorium. Alex felt his face grow warm. He knew that humans were newcomers to galactic society, but hearing his entire species described as primitive in front of hundreds of the galaxy's brightest minds was harder than he had expected. The human response is purely chemical, the professor explained. A simple hormone flood that provides marginal physical enhancement. They cannot phase shift like the Voltans, cannot communicate chemically like the Meridians, cannot armor themselves like the crystallines. It is perhaps the most basic fear response we have cataloged among sentient species. Alex's hand moved to his datapad. His notes from the past year of research filled the screen. Interviews with human soldiers, police officers, rescue workers, parents. Stories that didn't fit with Professor Kaleth's clinical description. He thought about Maria Santos, an emergency medical technician who had worked for 36 hours straight during the new Tokyo disaster, carrying injured people out of collapsed buildings while aftershocks continued to shake the city. He thought about the mining crew on Titan Station who had manually held pressure seals closed for 6 hours while waiting for rescue, knowing that letting go meant death for everyone in the station. The professor was still talking. This primitive response system has likely limited human expansion into more dangerous regions of space. Without sophisticated threat management, humans tend to avoid rather than explore truly hazardous environments. Alex looked around the auditorium. Every being here was an expert in their field. They had access to databases filled with information about every known species. If Professor Kaleth said humans had primitive fear responses, she must be right. The evidence was clear, the research was thorough, and Alex was just a junior researcher who had barely finished his basic studies. But something felt wrong. The professor moved to her conclusion. Understanding these various fear response mechanisms helps us predict how different species will react to new challenges, new environments, and new forms of cooperation. It also helps us understand the limitations each species faces as they expand into the galaxy. Alex's hand was already moving upward before he realized what he was doing. Around him, beings were preparing to applaud the presentation. The formal question period wouldn't begin for another few minutes. But his arm kept rising until his hand was fully extended above his head. Professor Kaleth paused mid-sentence, all four of her eyes focusing on him. The auditorium fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Hundreds of beings turned to look at the human in the back row who had just interrupted one of the most respected researchers in the galaxy. Yes? Professor Kaleth said, her voice carrying a note of irritation that the translation systems couldn't quite hide. Alex stood up slowly. His datapad trembled slightly in his free hand. Every instinct told him to sit back down, apologize for the interruption, and fade back into obscurity. These were people who had forgotten more about xenobiology than he would ever learn. Who was he to question their conclusions? But Maria Santos hadn't faded into obscurity when the buildings were collapsing. The miners on Titan Station hadn't sat down when the seals were failing. Professor, Alex said, his voice somehow steady. Despite the way his heart was pounding, I think there might be some gaps in your research on human fear response. The silence in the auditorium stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Alex could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, loud enough that he wondered if the sensitive hearing of some species might actually pick it up. Professor Kaleth's four eyes blinked in sequence, a sign that Alex had learned meant an Alterian was trying to process unexpected information. Mr. Reed, isn't it? Professor Kaleth said, her voice careful and controlled. While we certainly value diverse perspectives, in academic discourse, Our research is based on extensive xenobiological studies conducted by the finest scientific minds in the galaxy. These studies have been peer-reviewed, replicated, and verified across multiple institutions. Alex felt the weight of hundreds of stares. The manted researchers near the front had stopped their constant clicking and gone completely still. The Aquarians had ceased their soft bubbling sounds. Even the energy-based beings had dimmed their natural glow, as if trying not to draw attention to themselves while watching this confrontation unfold. "I understand that, Professor," Alex replied, his voice gaining strength. "And I'm not questioning the quality of the research or the expertise of the researchers, but I think the studies might have missed something important about how human fear response actually works." A low rumbling sound came from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium. Alex recognized it as the way Corallians expressed skepticism. These were beings whose entire culture was built around warrior traditions and combat prowess. If anyone would understand fear responses, it would be them. And they clearly didn't think a human had anything useful to add to the discussion. "Professor," Kaleth glanced at her chronometer, a device that displayed time in formats readable by dozens of different species. "Mr. Reed, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, we do have a schedule to maintain. Perhaps you could submit your concerns through the proper academic channels after the presentation." "Actually," Alex said, taking a step toward the aisle, "I was wondering if you'd be interested in a practical demonstration." The rumbling from the Corallians stopped abruptly. Several nebulans who had been floating peacefully near the ceiling began to descend toward their seats. The crystalline delegate, who had been maintaining a relaxed, flesh-like state, began to show the first hints of hardening around her joints. Professor Kaleth's scales shifted slightly, taking on a darker hue. "I'm not sure what you mean by demonstration, Mr. Reed." Alex stepped into the aisle and began walking slowly toward the front of the auditorium. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't making any aggressive gestures, but something in his movement pattern had changed. Where before he had seemed like just another researcher, slightly nervous and out of place, now there was something different in the way he carried himself. "What I mean is," Alex said, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustic systems, "your studies have all been conducted in laboratory settings with human volunteers who knew they were safe. They knew they were being observed by scientists, knew they could stop the experiment at any time, knew that nothing truly dangerous was happening to them." He paused at the end of one of the middle rows. A group of Alterian graduate students shifted in their seats, their scales beginning to show the same darkening pattern as their professor. "But that's not when human fear response really activates," Alex continued. "See, you've been studying the wrong thing entirely. Human fear response isn't about what happens when humans are afraid. It's about what happens when humans are afraid for someone else." Professor Kaleth's four eyes were now all focused directly on Alex. Her academic training told her to end this interruption and return to the planned presentation, but her scientific curiosity was stronger. Here was a human claiming that centuries of research had missed something fundamental about his species. "Very well, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "But please keep in mind that this is a scholarly environment with representatives from many different species. We must maintain appropriate academic protocols." Alex smiled, and several beings in the audience noticed that his expression had changed. It wasn't the nervous, apologetic smile of a junior researcher anymore. It was something else entirely, something that triggered recognition patterns in species that had evolved to identify potential threats. "Of course, Professor," Alex said, his tone perfectly reasonable and polite. "Purely educational." He continued walking toward the front, and with each step, subtle changes rippled through the audience. The Mantide's compound eyes were tracking his movement with predatory focus. The Aquarians had gone completely silent, their gill slits fluttering rapidly. The Voltan delegate began to flicker slightly, their form becoming translucent as their natural phase-shifting ability activated unconsciously. "The thing about human fear response," Alex said, his voice now carrying an undertone that seemed to resonate in frequencies that bypassed conscious hearing and went straight to the primitive parts of listeners' brains, "is that your researchers have been studying it backwards." He reached the front of the auditorium and turned to face the audience. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. Every being with advanced pattern recognition systems suddenly realized that Alex wasn't demonstrating how humans responded to fear. He was demonstrating what made other beings afraid. Human fear response isn't about running away or hiding or protecting ourselves, Alex explained, his voice dropping to just above a whisper but somehow still perfectly audible throughout the space. It's about what we become when someone threatens our pack. The word pack hit the audience like a physical force. Species across the galaxy used different terms: hive, collective, family, tribe, cluster, but they all understood the concept of the group that must be protected at all costs. And they were beginning to understand that Alex wasn't just a lone researcher making academic points. He was demonstrating the behavioral patterns of a species that had evolved not as prey, but as something much more dangerous. On Earth, Alex said, beginning to pace in a slow, methodical pattern that several species recognized as distinctly predatory. We have a saying, "Don't poke the bear." It means don't provoke something that seems harmless because you might not like what happens. When it stops being harmless, Professor Caleth found herself taking a step backward, though she couldn't explain why. Her rational mind knew she was in no danger. Alex was a fellow researcher. This was an academic conference, and there were security protocols in place. But something deeper, something that had kept her ancestors alive for millions of years, was telling her to put distance between herself and the human. The interesting thing about that saying, Alex continued, his smile growing wider, is that it's not about the bear being afraid. It's about what the bear does to the thing that poked it. The crystalline delegate was now visibly hardening, her skin taking on the reflective quality of her species' defensive state. The Corallian warrior had unconsciously moved all 4 of his arms into positions that would allow for rapid combat response. Even the peaceful Meridians were beginning to release stress pheromones, their antennae twitching with anxiety. "You see, Professor," Alex said, his attention returning to Caleth. "Human adrenaline doesn't just make us a little stronger and a little faster. It changes how we think. It changes how we perceive threats. It changes how we prioritize survival. Ours versus theirs." The temperature in the auditorium seemed to have dropped several degrees, though the environmental systems were functioning normally. Several species with empathic abilities were picking up emotional resonances they had never experienced before, ancient, primal patterns that spoke of things that hunted in the dark and took pleasure in the fear of their prey. When a human's fight-or-flight response activates, Alex explained, his voice now carrying harmonics that triggered alarm responses in over 20 different species simultaneously, the flight part stops being an option real quick if someone they care about is in danger. What's left is just the fight part. And humans, Professor, are really, really good at fighting. Alex stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the stage. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of various species breathing, clicking, humming, or making whatever sounds their physiology required for survival. But underneath it all, barely audible but somehow felt by everyone present, was the steady, slow rhythm of Alex's heartbeat, amplified by the auditorium's acoustic systems. "So," Alex said, his voice returning to its earlier conversational tone, though the undertones remained. "Would you like me to show you what human fear response actually looks like when it's properly activated?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that no one in the room quite understood, but everyone felt, in their bones. Professor Caleth realized that she had made a fundamental error in her research methodology. She had studied human fear response in isolation, under controlled conditions with subjects who had nothing to protect and nothing to lose. But Alex wasn't isolated, and he wasn't in a controlled environment. He was surrounded by hundreds of beings from across the galaxy, and something in his primitive mammalian brain had apparently decided that they represented some form of threat to his species. And now he was asking if they wanted to see what humans became when they stopped being afraid and started being something else entirely. Professor Caleth's silver scales had now darkened to an almost charcoal color, a physiological response she hadn't experienced since her childhood on Alteria Prime. Her scientific training warred with her survival instincts as she watched Alex stand motionless at the center of the stage, Everything about his posture screamed predator to the part of her brain that evolution had designed to keep her ancestors alive. "Mr. Reed," she said carefully, "I think perhaps we should return to the scheduled presentation format. Academic. Conferences have protocols for a reason and—" "Oh, I completely understand, Professor," Alex interrupted, his tone perfectly polite and reasonable. "But you see, that's exactly the problem with your research methodology. You're trying to study human behavior within artificial constraints. You're trying to observe a predator response in a zoo environment." The word predator sent ripples of unease through the audience. The mantid researchers had gone completely motionless, their compound eyes fixed on Alex with the kind of focus their species usually reserved for prey items. The Aquarians had begun a subtle color shift, their blue skin taking on darker hues. That indicated stress. "Humans didn't evolve in laboratories," Alex continued, beginning to walk in a slow circle around the center of the stage. "We evolved in an environment where everything wanted to kill us. Our planet was covered with predators that were bigger than us, stronger than us, faster than us, and better armed than us." He paused in his circling, facing directly toward the E section where the Corallian delegates sat. "Your people understand this concept, don't you? The idea that sometimes the best defense is to become something that other things don't want to fight?" The lead Corallian delegate, a massive being with 4 muscular arms and skin like flexible armor, found himself nodding involuntarily. His species had built their entire civilization around the principle that strength prevented conflict. But something about Alex's tone suggested that human strength was different from Corallian strength. "The difference," Alex said as if reading the Corallian's thoughts, "is that your people became strong to avoid fights. Humans became something else entirely. We became the thing that other predators have nightmares about." A soft whimpering sound came from somewhere in the middle of the auditorium. Alex's enhanced hearing, sharpened by the adrenaline now coursing through his system, identified it as coming from one of the Meridian delegates. Their empathic abilities were picking up emotional patterns that their species had no evolutionary framework for processing. "Let me tell you about human fear response," Alex said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. "When a human perceives a threat to their family, their tribe, their species, several things happen very quickly." He held up one finger. "First, pain tolerance increases by roughly 300%. Injuries that would incapacitate other species become minor inconveniences. A second finger. Reaction time decreases by approximately 40%. Pattern recognition becomes hyperacute. We can track multiple targets simultaneously while processing complex tactical scenarios in real time. A third finger. Strength increases, but that's just the beginning. What really happens is that our brain chemistry changes. We stop thinking like prey animals trying to avoid danger. We start thinking like apex predators hunting threats to our pack." The nebulons floating near the ceiling had descended almost to floor level, their gaseous forms compressed into tight defensive shapes. Several of the crystalline delegates were now completely diamond-hard, their transformed bodies reflecting the auditorium's lights in sharp, prismatic patterns. "But the most important change," Alex continued, his fourth finger now extended, "is psychological. Humans in a true fear response state don't just become more dangerous. We become creative about danger. We start looking for ways to eliminate threats permanently." Professor Callith realized that her research notes were lying on the floor beside her feet. She couldn't remember dropping them, but her hands were now empty and trembling slightly. Her 4 eyes were having trouble focusing on anything except Alex, as if her visual cortex had decided that nothing else in the room mattered. "On Earth," Alex said, resuming his slow pacing, "we have a species called the honey badger. Small animal, weighs maybe 30 pounds. But honey badgers have been observed attacking lions, fighting off entire packs of hyenas, and walking away from encounters with venomous snakes that could kill animals 50 times their size." He stopped pacing and looked directly at the audience. Humans are what honey badgers would become if they evolved opposable thumbs, complex language, and the ability to make tools. The atmospheric processors throughout the station were working overtime, but the air in the auditorium still felt thick and oppressive. Several species that communicated through electromagnetic fields were picking up interference patterns they had never encountered before. The source seemed to be Alex himself, as if his altered brain chemistry was generating some kind of bioelectric field. "Your research on human adrenaline production is correct," Alex acknowledged, his tone becoming almost conversational. "But you missed what that adrenaline is for. It's not for running away. It's not for temporary physical enhancement. It's for overriding every safety protocol evolution built into our brains to keep us from doing things that might get us killed." A clicking sound came from the mantid section, but it was different from their usual communication patterns. This was rapid, staccato, the sound their species made when their threat assessment systems were overloaded. "See, most species evolved fear responses to keep them alive," Alex explained. "Humans evolved a fear response to keep everyone else alive. When we get scared for other people, we become willing to do things that no rational being would consider. We become willing to walk into situations that have no good outcomes, just to make sure the bad outcomes happen to the right individuals." The Voltan delegate had now shifted completely out of phase, existing as barely visible outline in normal spacetime. Even from another dimension, they apparently didn't feel safe in the same reality as whatever Alex was becoming. "Let me paint you a picture," Alex said, his voice now carrying undertones that seemed to bypass hearing entirely and vibrate directly in the bones of every being present. "A human child is threatened by something bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than their parent. What do you think happens next?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's background hum seemed muted, as if the ship's AI had decided to reduce noise levels out of some primitive electronic survival instinct. "The threat dies," Alex said simply. "Maybe not immediately, maybe not easily, but it dies, because the human parent becomes something that won't stop, can't be reasoned with, and doesn't care about personal survival anymore. They become a force of nature focused on a single objective." Professor Kalath found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Reed, I think you've made your point about the limitations of our research methodology." "Have I?" Alex asked, tilting his head slightly. The gesture looked almost innocent, but somehow managed to be more unsettling than anything he had done so far. "Because I'm looking around this room and I'm seeing a lot of very intelligent beings who are all displaying fear responses right now. And I haven't actually done anything threatening." He was right. The crystalline delegates were diamond hard. The Voltans were phased out of normal reality. The Nebulans were compressed into defensive formations. The Corallians were in combat-ready stances. The Meridians were releasing distress pheromones in concentrations that were beginning to affect other species. "All I've done is talk," Alex continued. "I've shared some information about human psychology and evolutionary biology. I've used a slightly different tone of voice. I've changed my posture and movement patterns. And every species in this room is now displaying the exact fear responses that you've spent your career cataloging." Professor Kalath's academic mind finally grasped what was happening. "You're not demonstrating human fear response at all. You're demonstrating what triggers fear responses in other species." "Exactly," Alex said, his smile returning but somehow looking nothing like the nervous expression he had worn when he first stood up. "Human fear response isn't about being afraid. It's about becoming the thing that other species are afraid of." The implications hit the audience like a wave. Every being in the room was a researcher, trained to observe and analyze behavioral patterns. And they were all suddenly aware that they had been unconsciously displaying prey behaviors in response to a single human who hadn't made a single overtly threatening gesture. "The really interesting part," Alex said, his voice now carrying a note of scientific curiosity that somehow made him sound even more dangerous, "is that this isn't even a real human fear response. This is just me talking about human fear response, while thinking about how much I care about my species being misunderstood by the galactic community." He looked around the auditorium, taking in the various defensive postures and stress responses. "If you want to see what humans are like when we're actually afraid for someone we love, well," he shrugged, a casual gesture that made several beings flinch involuntarily. That would require a very different kind of demonstration. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees as hundreds of some of the galaxy's most intelligent beings contemplated what a very different kind of demonstration might look like. And in the back of the auditorium, the station's security AI quietly upgraded the threat assessment on one apparently unremarkable human researcher. The emergency lighting systems throughout the station flickered once, then stabilized. Alex noticed this but didn't comment on it. The station's AI was probably running threat assessments and didn't like what it was calculating. He couldn't blame it. Most artificial intelligences were designed by species that understood fear as a survival mechanism. They weren't programmed to process the concept of a species that used fear as a weapon. "Professor Kaleth," Alex said, his voice returning to something approaching normal conversational tones. "Your research mentions that humans avoid dangerous regions of space due to our primitive fear response systems. Is that correct?" The Alterian professor had managed to regain some of her composure, though her scales remained dark and her four eyes kept darting between Alex and the various exit points around the auditorium. "Yes, that's one of our conclusions based on human expansion patterns compared to other species." "Interesting," Alex mused, clasping his hands behind his back in a gesture that looked casual, but somehow made every predatory species in the room tense up. "Because humans have established colonies and systems with Class 7 radiation storms, on planets with atmospheric pressures that would crush most species, and in regions of space where the local wildlife includes things that eat starships," he began walking again, but this time his path took him closer to the audience seating areas. Beings shifted away from the aisles as he passed, though most of them couldn't consciously explain why they felt the need to increase the distance between themselves and the human. Humans live on worlds where the local bacteria can dissolve metal, where the plant life is actively carnivorous, and where the weather patterns include phenomena that other species classify as natural disasters, Alex continued. "We've built cities in places where simply breathing the air would kill most galactic citizens within minutes." The rock art delegate, whose silicon-based physiology made him nearly indestructible by most standards, found himself feeling uncomfortable with Alex's proximity. Something about the human's movement patterns triggered recognition systems that the rock heart usually associated with geological catastrophes, the kind of slow, inevitable forces that could grind mountains into sand. "But you're right about one thing," Alex said, pausing next to a row of Meridian researchers. Their stress pheromones were now so concentrated that several other species were beginning to feel the effects. Humans do respond differently to dangerous environments than other species. We don't avoid them. We move into them, set up permanent settlements, and then we adapt them to be more suitable for raising our children. Professor Kaleth's academic training finally reasserted itself enough for her to ask a question. "Mr. Reed, are you suggesting that human expansion patterns are actually aggressive rather than defensive in nature?" "I'm suggesting," Alex replied, turning to face her directly, "that your entire framework for understanding human behavior is backwards. You've been studying us as if we're just another prey species that happened to develop technology. But prey species don't colonize death worlds. Prey species don't build settlements in regions of space that other civilizations mark as uninhabitable or extremely hazardous." The holographic display above the stage, which had been showing peaceful star charts during Professor Kaleth's presentation, began flickering through different images. The station's AI seemed to be running its own analysis, pulling up data about human colonies and expansion patterns. "Prey species," Alex continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer who was explaining something obvious to particularly slow students, "build their civilizations in safe places. They choose planets with stable weather, predictable geology, and non-hostile native life forms. They establish trade routes through secure space lanes and avoid regions with known dangers." The holographic display now showed a three-dimensional map of human space. Red markers indicated colony worlds, yellow lines showed shipping routes, and pulsing orange zones marked areas of known hazards. What became immediately apparent was that human colonies weren't clustered in the safest regions of space. They were spread throughout areas that other species had marked as too dangerous for permanent settlement. Humans, Alex said, gesturing toward the display. Build their settlements wherever they find resources they need, regardless of local hazards. They establish shipping routes through unstable regions because those routes are shorter and more efficient. They colonize planets that other species won't even visit, because those planets have materials or strategic positions that serve human interests. A soft keening sound came from the Nebulan section of the audience. Their gaseous forms were now compressed into tight, defensive spheres that barely qualified as individual entities. The sound they were making was the acoustic equivalent of their species' equivalent of a distress call. That's not the behavior of a prey species with primitive fear responses, Alex explained, his tone becoming almost gentle, which somehow made his words more unsettling than when he had been openly threatening. That's the behavior of an apex, predator species that views the galaxy as its hunting territory. The Corallian delegate, despite his warrior training and four-armed physiology, found his voice when he asked, "What about human diplomatic efforts? Your species has been instrumental in resolving several interspecies conflicts. That suggests cooperation, not predation." Alex's smile returned, and this time there was something almost fond in his expression. "Oh, humans are excellent at cooperation. We have to be. See, the thing about being an apex predator species is that eventually you run out of other things to hunt. So you have to learn to work together, or you end up hunting each other." He moved away from the Meridian researchers who, collectively exhaled in relief as the concentration of threatening pheromones around them decreased. Humans resolve conflicts between other species because conflicts are wasteful. They disrupt trade, they damage infrastructure, and they prevent efficient resource extraction from contested regions. The holographic display shifted again, showing trade routes and economic data. Human involvement in various diplomatic resolutions was highlighted, and patterns began to emerge. In every case, human-mediated solutions resulted in increased stability, expanded commerce, and greater access to resources for all parties involved. When humans resolve conflicts, Alex continued, everyone benefits. The species involved get peace and prosperity. Human merchants get access to new markets. Human colonies get strategic partnerships and resource agreements. It's elegant, efficient, and ensures that everyone has strong incentives to maintain the peace. Professor Kaleth was beginning to see the larger picture, and it was not comforting. You're describing a protection racket on a galactic scale. I am describing a successful survival strategy, Alex corrected. Humans learned a long time ago that the best way to ensure the safety of your own pack is to make sure everyone else in the neighborhood is healthy, prosperous, and grateful for your assistance in maintaining order. The Voltan delegate flickered, back into normal space-time long enough to ask, "And if someone threatens that order?" Alex's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Professor Kalath's research is correct about human adrenaline production. When humans perceive a threat to their community, their brain chemistry changes. Pain tolerance increases, reaction time improves, strength is enhanced. But those are just the physical symptoms. He turned to address the entire auditorium, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the space. The real change is psychological. Humans stop thinking about personal survival and start thinking about threat elimination. We become capable of sustained, coordinated, creative violence on a scale that most species can't even conceptualize. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of various life support systems working overtime to maintain atmospheric conditions for beings whose physiological stress responses were pushing environmental systems to their limits. The last time a species made the mistake of directly threatening human civilians, Alex said, his tone becoming conversational again, that species no longer exists, not because of war, not because of disease, not because of natural disaster. They no longer exist because they made humans afraid for their children. Professor Kalath realized that her centuries of research had missed the most fundamental aspect of human psychology. Humans didn't have primitive fear responses. They had evolved beyond fear entirely. What other species experienced as fear, humans experienced as a targeting system. 3 hours after Alex finished speaking, the Galactic Institute's main auditorium was still mostly empty. A few maintenance drones hummed quietly as they cleaned up scattered datapads and personal belongings that various delegates had dropped during their hurried exits. The holographic projectors continued displaying human colonial expansion data, though no one was there to observe the patterns that painted such a disturbing picture of organized, methodical expansion across the galaxy. Alex sat in the front row, sipping coffee from a container he had replicated from the station's food systems. The bitter liquid helped ground him, bringing his elevated biochemistry back toward normal levels. He could feel his enhanced pattern recognition system slowly cycling down, his hyperacute awareness of potential threats fading to manageable levels. The transformation back to baseline human psychology was always gradual, like coming down from a mountain peak. Professor Caleth emerged from a side corridor where she had spent the last 2 hours reviewing her research data and making frantic calculations. Her silver scales had returned to their normal hue, but her 4 eyes still showed signs of stress. She approached Alex cautiously, as if he might suddenly revert to the predatory state he had demonstrated earlier. "Mr. Reed," she said, settling into a seat several positions away from him, "I owe you a formal apology. Our research methodology was fundamentally flawed." Alex turned to look at her, and she was relieved to see that his expression was mild, almost apologetic. "Professor, there's nothing to apologize for. Your research was solid within its parameters. The problem was that those parameters didn't account for the circumstances that actually trigger human protective responses." She activated a personal, holographic display and began showing him preliminary calculations. "I've been running projections based on the behavioral patterns you described. If humans respond to perceived threats to their community with the kind of coordinated aggression you demonstrated, the implications for galactic stability are enormous." "Are they?" Alex asked, genuinely curious. "How so?" Professor Caleth manipulated the display to show population distribution across human space. "Look at these patterns. Human colonies aren't randomly distributed. They're positioned to control strategic resources, major shipping lanes, and defensive choke points throughout this entire sector of the galaxy. If your species was planning some kind of territorial expansion—" "Professor," Alex interrupted gently, "we're not planning expansion. We're planning survival. There's a difference." The holographic display shifted to show threat assessment data from the Institute's databases. "But your species has only been in contact with galactic civilization for 15 years. In that time, you've established colonies on 43 worlds, created trade relationships with over 30 species, and mediated diplomatic solutions to 7 major interspecies conflicts." Alex nodded. "Sounds about right." "That's not normal. Integration behavior," Professor Caleth insisted. "Most species take centuries to establish that kind of galactic presence. The pattern suggests either remarkable adaptability or we're very good at identifying and neutralizing potential threats before they become actual threats." Alex finished. "Professor, human survival strategy isn't complicated. We make friends with everyone we can, we make ourselves indispensable to everyone who'll let us, and we make sure that anyone who might want to hurt our friends knows exactly what the consequences would be." The Corallian delegate chose that moment to enter the auditorium, moving with the careful precision of a warrior who wasn't entirely sure whether he was approaching an ally or an enemy. His forearms were positioned in what Alex recognized as a neutral but combat-ready stance. "Human Reed," the Corallian said, using the formal address structure his species employed when uncertain of relative status. "My people would like to understand something about your demonstration earlier." "Of course," Alex replied, gesturing for the large being to join them. "What would you like to know?" The Corallian settled into a reinforced seat designed for his species' bulk. "You spoke of humans eliminating threats to their community. My people are warriors. We understand the concept of defending one's territory, but you implied something beyond mere defense." Alex considered his words carefully. "Your people fight for honor, for territory, for resources, for status within your society. Is that correct?" "Yes," the Corallian confirmed. "Combat serves multiple purposes in our culture. It establishes hierarchies, resolves disputes, and demonstrates worthiness. Humans fight for simpler reasons, Alex said. We fight to protect the people we love. That's it. No honor, no territory, no resources, no status. Just protection. And, because our motivation is simpler, our methods can be more comprehensive. Professor Kalath looked up from her calculations. What do you mean by comprehensive? Alex set down his coffee container and leaned back in his seat. When humans perceive a threat to our community, we don't just neutralize the immediate danger. We eliminate the source of the threat, the support systems that enabled the threat, and any similar threats that might emerge in the future. We call it making sure it never happens again. The Corallian's eyes widened. In his warrior culture, combat had rules, limits, concepts of honorable surrender, and acceptable victory conditions. You're describing total warfare. I'm describing parental instinct scaled up to species level, Alex corrected. When a human parent protects their child, they don't just stop the immediate danger. They make sure that danger can never threaten their child again. Ever. Professor Kalath's calculations were becoming more complex as she incorporated these new parameters into her models. The extinct species you mentioned earlier. The one that threatened human civilians. The Ravagers, Alex confirmed. Lovely. People, actually. Highly intelligent, technologically advanced, excellent artists. They had a cultural practice that involved taking members of other species as, let's call them involuntary cultural participants. Usually children because they adapted more easily to Ravager society. The silence stretched on as the implications sank in. When they took the first human children, Alex continued, his tone remaining conversational, our government sent diplomatic protests. When they took more children, we offered to negotiate. When they took an entire human colony's worth of children and announced that this was just the beginning of a new cultural exchange program, well, Professor Kalath stopped her calculations entirely. What happened? Humans stopped being diplomatic, Alex said simply. The Ravager homeworld is now a nature preserve. Very beautiful this time of year, I'm told. Lots of wildlife, pristine ecosystems, archaeological sites that are fascinating to study. No Ravagers, of course, but that was the point. The Corallian delegate found his voice. Your people committed genocide. Our people eliminated a threat to human children, Alex corrected. The fact that this required the complete removal of Ravager civilization was simply a practical necessity. You can't negotiate with a species whose cultural practices require kidnapping your offspring. Professor Kalath's research notes were scattered across her display as she tried to process this information. But the galactic community, there was no record of this conflict in our databases. Because it wasn't a conflict, Alex explained. Conflicts involve two sides fighting. This was pest control. The Ravagers were a problem, so humans solved the problem. Efficiently, permanently, and with minimal disruption to galactic stability. The auditorium's environmental systems hummed quietly as they processed the emotional and pheromonal residue from hundreds of beings who had experienced primal fear. Alex stood up and stretched, his movements casual and unthreatening now that his demonstration was over. The funny thing is, he said, most species in the galaxy are safer now because of what happened to the Ravagers. Other potential predators looked at what humans did and decided that maybe kidnapping sentient beings wasn't such a profitable enterprise after all. Professor Kalath began gathering her scattered research notes. I'll need to completely revise our threat assessment protocols for humans. Actually, Alex said, I'd suggest revising them for everyone. Now that the galactic community understands how human protective instincts work, everybody's children are safer. Species that might have preyed on weaker civilizations now know that humans consider all sentient beings part of the extended family we're obligated to protect. The Corallian delegate stood, his warrior's posture now showing something approaching respect. Your species has established itself as the apex predator of galactic civilization. Our species has established itself as the parent of galactic civilization, Alex corrected. There's a difference. Parents don't just protect their own children, they protect all the children in the neighborhood. As Alex walked toward the auditorium exit, Professor Kalath called after him. Mr. Reed, what happens if someone threatens the galactic community as a whole? Alex paused at the doorway and smiled. It was a warm, genuine expression that contained no hint of the predatory intensity he had displayed earlier. Professor, that would be a very bad idea, because then humans wouldn't just be afraid for their own species, we'd be afraid for everyone. The door closed behind him with a soft whisper of escaping air, leaving Professor Kaleth and the Corallian delegate alone in the auditorium, with their new understanding of humanity's role in the galaxy. Outside the station's viewports, the stars continued their ancient dance through the cosmos, unaware that the balance of galactic civilization had just shifted in ways that would echo through the centuries. In research stations and diplomatic centers across hundreds of worlds, beings were updating their databases with a single simple notation that would change everything. Humans, do not threaten their pack, ever.